Hello, class, and welcome to the module on policymaking by the President. Now, in this module, I think this module is really well placed, if I don't say so myself, because it's really speaking to what we were talking about with Jenkins and Milkus, right? Because Jenkins and Milkus were talking about how with the expansion of government responsibilities, we actually end up expecting so much more from the government, so much more about the government solving our problems, right? Solving social problems. And what's interesting, though, is that this is especially true for the president, right? We expect the president to solve all kinds of issues, whether they be economic or social. So we expect the president to solve issues of poverty, of health care, of climate change, immigration, even gas prices, right? We expect the president to solve all these problems, but does the president have this power? It's a tough question, probably not. And the reading for this week spoke to the ways that presidential administrations can, though, take action, right? Can take unilateral action and without the consent of Congress. It asked the question, when do presidents unilaterally direct public policy, and to what effect? And in many ways, it was a reading about presidential power, again, right? Now, there are a few things to break down here with respect to presidential power before we actually get started. So, okay, what's the power of the president? Well, it's weird, actually, because it's pretty hard to say. Article 2 of the Constitution is ambiguous about the power of the president, and ambiguous in a way that it is not with respect to Congress, right? In Article 1 that outlines the powers of Congress very explicitly. Article 2 is not explicit, and in the most traditional sense, the president is not meant to make policy, but is instead positioned to ensure the enactment of policy, right? Enacting policy. And that's a big statement. So again, let me just say it again. Traditionally, the president is not meant to make policy, but is instead positioned to ensure the proper enactment of policy. Okay, so let's break that down into pieces. First, the president doesn't make policy. Okay, well, because of this constitutional assumption, most political scholars of the president, especially in the 20th century, tied the presidential power to his ability to influence policymakers, right? And this is mainly to influence Congress, okay? Now, the most noteworthy of this work is by Richard Neustadt in his book, Presidential Power, which is a seminal piece of literature, and it is discussed at length in the reading. So let's take a closer look.
Okay, so Richard Neustadt wrote this book, Presidential Power, in 1960. And his contribution, again, this book is hailed as one of the most important of the 20th century. And his contribution was that the president's power lies in his or her, in theory, ability to persuade. And by persuasion, Neustadt did not just mean charm. He meant the ability to convince others, mainly those who, make policy, aka critical and influential members of Congress, that what he wanted was in fact what they wanted. It's the ability to convince others that in order to do what is in their best interest, right, because everyone is guided by their own self-interest after all, that these individuals should follow the president's agenda, because what's in the president's agenda should in fact also be on their agenda. And that's the convincing, that's the persuasion, right? It's the president's ability to convince others to want the same thing he or she wants. Now, in fact, if the president used formal executive powers to get what he wanted, it was, by this body of research, widely considered, again, as a function of Neustadt's work, a sign of weakness, right? It's weak to use these formal executive powers because a veto, for instance, means that the president's powers of persuasion to influence Congress have failed, right? These executive powers were considered to be in the negative, right, to strike down potential policy. But the key influence, the key real power is in influencing policy itself. And that, Neustadt argued, was all about the power to persuade.
Now, a broad and extensive body of research developed from Neustat's work. Speaking to how elements of the professional reputation or the prestige of a president in the public, right, could enhance or diminish the president's power to persuade and thus make policy. But as Howell points out, all of this work was rooted in the idea that the president doesn't really make substantive policy unilaterally, that he or she eventually, hopefully, is dependent on others for his or her influence, right? And as discussed in the reading, most of the literature on institutional power of the president, examine the success in Congress, right? To examine the president's success in swaying Congress members or leaders in Congress to do what he or she, in theory, wants, right? But it's not considering, for instance, the power of the president outside of Congress. That's very rare. And so, thinking about the president's power as contingent on, his or her ability to influence Congress isn't quite accurate, right? And that's what Howell's bringing up. And one key observation Howell makes is that if presidential power is indeed contingent on persuasion, right? If persuasion is a function of, the individual, of personal qualities, then we should expect to see the power of the presidency over time to vary somewhat randomly, right? Because if it's all based on the individual, then there shouldn't be any kind of discernible or systemic trend. And it has everything to do with the person, right? So it's varying person to person, and we shouldn't see the trend that we in fact do see. Because the power of the president is increasing. The use of the executive, orders and the different administrative opportunities for influence and for policy making that the president has at his disposal is increasing, okay? So we do see this trend despite idiosyncrasies across presidents. And that means that it can't just be all about the power of persuasion, right? Power of the presidency has increased over time as a function of the president's executive administrative powers.
The executive administrative powers here are key because the fact of the matter is that presidents make law without the consent of Congress. Sometimes without even notifying Congress or filing a published report. And as the size of the federal government has grown since the New Deal, so too has the size of the executive. It's grown substantially. And this is where the constitutional power of the president to enact law, to execute law, ends up shaping his or her ability to create law. Because what this means is that the president now has a vast web of agencies and bureaucracies that implement policy, enforce laws at their discretion, and then answer to the president, right? Or at least in practice most of the time. Bureaucrats, those in the departments, right, from the cabinet, for instance, are interesting because they also answer to Congress, but executive agencies don't. Now, as the reading points out, these individuals do have and often exert a good deal of their own independence, right? They can ignore the president if they so choose. But the president does have the formal power to choose who fills these roles. He or she does so with a mind towards congruent ideology and policy preferences. That's who he or she chooses to fill these positions. And so the president sits as the executive in every sense of the word. And what this executive means is hierarchy. And sitting at the top of a hierarchy of power is unique to the presidency. In no other branch of the federal government, and especially not in Congress, does an individual hold that kind of hierarchical power. And what's more, the president can make policy with very little transaction costs, right? Transaction costs, what is that? Well, he doesn't need to form a broad coalition of support, right? Which takes a great deal of time. Making sure that policy proposed is democratic and best serves the maximum number of people's interests, right? He might suffer political ramifications, and that might, stop the president from doing executive orders sometimes. But if the president, if it's in the president's prerogative to do an executive order independent of politics, he or she can. There's no transaction cost necessary, right? This doesn't need to pass through Congress. And, with little transaction costs, the president can create policy quickly, and Congress, we know, cannot. And this is this interesting dynamic between the president and Congress, because in many respects they're in competition. Where Congress fails to act, presidents often take up the initiative, pursue their own agendas. And this sort of quick action that Congress is failing to take is often why we therefore look to the president in times of crisis, right? Because unilateral action is quick, and in crisis, that kind of action is often necessary. So, with that in hand, the president creates policy and law unilaterally, insulated from Congress and the judiciary in many respects through the separation of powers. He, or someday she, does so by issuing executive orders, proclamations, or executive agreements which relate to international relations. Or sometimes, as with President Obama, through presidential memoranda, which are much less easily tracked historically because they are not required to be published in the Federal Registrar, whereas executive orders are. Obama did end up publishing many of his memoranda, which had some of the strongest substantive policy implications for immigration and with gun regulations, for instance. And he did so reportedly with an interest in transparency. But one might imagine that there could be some potential political reasons for this as well. Now, what's more, as Congress cries foul at the extension of executive powers, and the threat of the president in their own policymaking jurisdictions, right? Overstepping of the president into Congress's duties. And this is another historical constant. We see this with almost every single president. History will, look back on the Obama administration and see fewer executive orders than his predecessors, right? So he might have also been thinking about his legacy with respect to these calculations. But nonetheless, these methods are unilateral action. These are the different, tactics that the president can use to effectively create law, right? It has all the power of law, and they are therefore powerful. So we'll discuss in class, and as discussed in these readings, right, with respect to President George W. Bush post 9/11, right, this is power, and these unilateral actions often have very big impacts. So we'll go through some examples and examine their policymaking legacies in class.
Okay, so now all of that being said, Howell illuminates another key point here, and that is that the president, when taking unilateral action as he does to set policy, he is in fact the first mover, and it's a big first mover, right? Because it's not just that he's setting, the tone for negotiation. In fact, there is no negotiation, right, Neustadt? There's no power of persuasion here. Persuasion is kind of irrelevant because the president is just saying, hey, I've done this. I've set the policy. Now I sit back and I say, okay, Congress, try to reverse me, right? Courts, challenge me, right? Do you have the time? Do you have the coalitional strength to take action, right? Do you have the legal foundations to challenge me in court? Because it's important to note, right? Historically, presidents have huge teams of legal, advisors in, helping them formulate these executive orders, these memorandums. So the president's asking these other branches, do you have the costly resources and the time to reverse what I've just done, right? Which is effectively making of law. That element, the element of the first mover, is critical. It's one of the most critical pieces here. Now, what was not covered in the reading, okay? It wasn't covered in the reading much at all, is that these unilateral actions are, as strong as they might be, as, low in transaction costs and as first mover, as they may be, they are in fact temporary, right? Because they can completely, and at relatively low cost, be completely reversed, right? They can be just reversed by the next sitting president, right? And so they depend on the president's power of persuasion with respect to their enforcement also, because bureaucrats can and often do, do whatever they want, irrespective of the president's wishes. This can happen, right? Bureaucrats are there, and we'll talk about that when we talk about bureaucratic policy making, right? But consider this temporary feature, okay? So what happens? How temporary is temporary? They are, technically speaking, temporary, right? But what happens when executive orders make law? when they change the way policy is enacted and implemented on the ground, you know? What happens, not just inside of government, but outside of government? We'll discuss that in depth in class, so give it some good thought, keep your thinking caps on, and with that, I will see you on Tuesday. I cannot wait. Keep up the good work, and see you soon.